Rise up again.
Rise, son.
Rise up.
Rise, son.
Rise up.
Let me tell you what we about to do, cause it's about that time. We gon' rise again. Yes, we gon' rise again. We gon' rise again. Gon' rise again. Yes, we gon' rise again. We gon' rise again. Gon' rise again. Yes, we gon' rise again.
Rise up again.
Gon' rise again. Yes, we gon' rise again. Check it. Straight from the ashes of melanin harassment. Rise like a phoenix from the floor of the Atlantic. Folks on a boat that was destined for crashing. Built a whole country, got paid in some lashes. Stripped all our culture and told us be happy. Hair defy gravity, they called it nappy. Broke up our homes, then locked up our pappies. Killed all our leaders and asked where it's at. But yet we progress in this world being black. My people of colors, my brothers, that's facts. We struggle and strive for the crumbs like we rats. Crabs in no buckets. Y'all holding us back. Uplift your brothers and sisters, don't slack. And do what you can for the hood and give back. Grow your own food and always buy black. We help build this nation and we need to take it back. Okay, yeah.
We gonna rise again. We gonna rise again. We gonna rise again. We gonna rise again.
If you think what I'm saying is division, I know I'm black power, but homie, just listen. What's good for the brother is good for the sister. The goose and the gander, I'm never gonna pander, but I'm hoping.
Good afternoon. Hope all is well out there. We are so excited that you could join us this afternoon. My name is Dr. Lamont Ali Francis, and I will be your host this afternoon on this joyous academic, educational, and enlightening journey through Blackness, through anti-racism, and the pursuit of racial resistance. This spring, we beseech you to stimulate your minds and enhance your knowledge of the realities of racial dehumanization by registering for the Black Male Studies course taught by Lane College's own Dr. Lawrence A. Rashid. This spring, we want you to learn about Black males, learn about the lies, learn about the literature and the legacy. Please register soon as space is limited. We want to welcome you to Lane Community College, which is located in the heart of beautiful Eugene, Oregon, otherwise known as Emerald City, the birthplace of the global brand Nike. Lane Community College serves more than 26,000 credit and non-credit students annually, offering a number of 2-year associate degrees, career technical, applied certificates, and pre-college classes that focus on reading, writing, mathematics, and study skills. Lane Community College is a state-of-the-art educational institution whose president is dedicated to social justice and providing equitable outcomes for all students. Dr. Margaret Hamilton joined Lane Community College as the 7th president in July of 2017. She is widely respected in the executive community of community college education. She holds a PhD in nursing education from Widener University in Pennsylvania, and her background includes strategic planning, curriculum development, human relations, in both workforce and economic development. Without further ado, I would like to bring forth the current president of Lane Community College, Dr. Margaret Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton.
Oh, thank you so much for that warm welcome, Dr. Francis, and welcome everybody to today's event, and a very special welcome to all our presenters tonight. Dr. Tommy Curry, Dr. Fred Bonner, Dr. Marvin Lynn, and Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. I am so humbled to have such experts, such authors and scholars here with us today to talk to us. We are so very fortunate to have these highly regarded experts in Black male studies talk to us today about how we can better support our Black male students here at Lane Community College. Our goal is for every student to achieve their goals, and our challenge is to eliminate institutional barriers. that will help our Black male students be even more successful. So thank you all for being here. At this time, I'll hand it back over to Dr. Francis.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. At this time, we are going to introduce a brother who is on fire. He is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Cal State Fresno. He founded numerous programs there, including the Africana Studies Online Teleconference for Black Male Studies, the Onyx Black Male Film Festival, the African American Edge Initiative, and the Hip Hop Research and Interview Project, in which he was able to bring in some of the most conscious, socially conscious rappers of our time. Those like KRS-One. He was able to interview Kumo D, the same man who never ran from the Ku Klux Klan, so he shouldn't have to run from a Black man. And so without further ado, let's play the video for Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. Powerful, powerful. And at this time, I'm going to introduce Dr. Marvin Lynn. Dr. Marvin Lynn is an educational leader, a scholar, cultural critic, an artist, and a father. He has served in a variety of leadership roles at urban public institutions of various types and sizes. Dr. Lynn currently serves as a professor and dean of the College of Education at Portland State University. He has studied music since the age of 14 and performed in church choirs since the age of 7. And Dr. Lynn, if you didn't know, has also performed as a professional opera singer. So without further ado, we would like to bring forth Dr. Marvin Lynn. How you doing, brother?
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. I'm just here to say hello and to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've done in advance of this really great presentation today. I'm just honored to have been invited by my brother, Lawrence Rashid, and to be among this really august group of scholars who are doing such exciting work. So thank you for having me, and I'm just excited to be here. I've spent the last 28 years as an educator. I started my career as an elementary teacher, and I've been a faculty member. I started as a part-time adjunct faculty member in 1998, and I got a tenure-track job at the University of Maryland in 2001. And since that time, I've been in a variety of roles, as they've said, from coordinator to associate dean to dean. I've made the decision this year to step back from the dean role. I've been doing that for about a decade, and I'm looking forward to being much more involved in some community transformation efforts, maybe school board and other types of things, maybe even getting involved in some political work. So we'll see what happens, but I look forward to continuing the scholarship that I've been involved in on Black male teachers, which I'm going to say a little bit about now. Back in '99, when I was finishing my dissertation at UCLA, I expressed a real interest in, first of all, the study of race, but I was also interested in the study of Black teachers. Particularly, I was trying to understand what was the impact of their work, and why were they so misunderstood? Because as a Black teacher myself, I felt highly misunderstood. I felt underappreciated, and I felt that Black males in particular were not successful, were not retained. And so I was trying to understand the dynamics, and my research lens that I got helped me to do that. And so I began to look at critical race theory. Critical race theory offers a critique of racism, a systematic critique of racism in the US. And it really calls attention to the enduring legacy of racism, both past and present. It critiques claims of neutrality, right, that we hear so much about, objectivity and so on. But it's also based on the experience of racially marginalized people. And it calls for the elimination of racism. And so critical race theory was really the right way in which to situate the work that I was beginning to do at that time on Black male teachers. And I published an article that was well received on the way in which Black male teachers are viewed, and how their work is oftentimes misunderstood. But I was also interested in talking to Black male teachers themselves about what they were doing, what they were learning, and how that was impacting their students. And so when I looked at the literature on that, I saw, and this speaks, I think, to some of what we're going to hear later, is that there is this overall claim. When you look at the literature on teaching, there is this discussion around teaching that does not involve race, that teaching is a sort of raceless kind of apolitical, non-political act. And that there's a large body of literature that sort of suggests that. Then there's another body of literature that I was looking at the time that does have sort of Black men as subjects who are active in the classroom and doing good work, but that frames them as abusive, as harsh disciplinarians, right? In the little classroom in the corner and so on. And that points to a reality for some. But what I found when I looked at the literature on Black educators is there's this richness in terms of how Black teachers are represented, and in terms of the important role that they play in advancing the lives and connecting to students of color so that they can be successful academically and so on. What I found, though, was missing from that was a specific conversation about Black men. And so that's where my literature came in. And I did qualitative studies that helped me really understand the experiences and the power and the richness that Black men bring to the table when they have an express commitment to working on behalf of BIPOC learners. And so today, if you look back, 20 years, and if you look at what's happening now, there are studies that look at sort of Black men who see themselves in multiple ways, of Black men who are looking at issues of gender and sexuality, and who are considering that as part of how they then work in the classroom. There are studies that look at Black men who come from different class backgrounds. There are studies that look at Black men who are from Africa or from the Caribbean. And so there's a variety of different ways in which Black men in education, I think, are viewed today very differently than when I started. And so I'm just excited to still be part of this conversation and to support, I think, the work that we're going to hear about and learn about today from these amazing scholars who I think are doing work that situates at the intersection of sort of critique of race and gender, but also articulates a very specific and very important Black male perspective. So thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lynn. At this time, we want to bring out a professor who is renowned. He is the Endowed Chair in Educational Leadership and Counseling, and the founding executive director of the Minority Achievement, Creativity, and High Ability Center at Prairie View A&M University. He has earned a doctorate in education and higher education education administration and college teaching from the University of Arkansas. And throughout his career, his work has consistently been centered on microcultural populations, developing attitudes, motivations and strategies to survive in a macro cultural setting. Dr. Fred Bonner has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the American Association for Higher Education Black Caucus Dissertation Award and the Educational Leadership Award. He is also the author of a recent release book on building resilience, models and frameworks of Black male success across the P20 pipeline. Dr. Bonner is internationally known as a scholar of race and education. So without further ado, I would like to bring out the Honorable Dr. Fred A. Bonner. Dr. Bonner. How you doing, Dr. Bonner? Good to see you.
Doing great. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I, like my good friend and colleague and good brother, Marvin Lynn, I am so excited about being here and participating in this clearly important forum. My research, my life, my foray into the world of academia has always been rooted in my work that focuses on academically gifted and talented African-American males. So that has been the beginning, the middle, and the end of my journey in higher education, focusing on what it means to be at the intersection of being academically gifted, talented, Black, and male. So I, again, thank Dr. Lynn. I thank you for the great introduction. It's wonderful to have the president here. That just shows her commitment to what we're doing and what we're attempting to do to foreground success for Black male populations, kind of across the Black male diaspora, from those who are some on the academic margins all the way to those who are achieving at rates and at heights that have been unparalleled. So excited to be here and glad to participate in this forum. And I will share a bit later about higher education and my work that has focused on high achieving African-American males, particularly in the higher ed context. So one of the things that I have attempted to do is to foreground what it means to be gifted, Black, and male in historically Black college and university context, as well as predominantly white institutional context.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And so are we going to bring out our keynote speaker at this time? I can bring him out. All right. I am very honored and very excited to bring out Dr. Tommy Curry. I am a huge fan of his presentation that will be dealing with the stratification of racialized males during a pandemic and the importance of Black male studies is something I've been looking forward to for a long time. Dr. Curry is a very sought-after scholar and a speaker. He is one of the nation's leading philosophers on Black male studies. He is an expert on critical race theory and Africana philosophy and social political thought. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Without further ado, I would like to bring forth Dr. Tommy Curry. Dr. Curry.
Thank you so much for that introduction. President Hamilton, it's certainly a pleasure. I'm humbled by the invitation, and I hope to not disappoint. Let me begin by saying that Fred Bonner and Marvin Lynn have certainly been an influence on my work and my academic trajectory. I was reading Marvin Lynn's work back when I was in grad school on critical race theory. You know, back when Derek Bell was still alive, you know, he and I used to actually have conversations about how people were using him in education. Lynn's work actually came up several times. And Fred Bonner was an excellent mentor to me when I started off my career as a young assistant professor at Texas A&M. So it's tremendously humbling to be able to share a panel, even if it's virtual, with you gentlemen. The presentation that I'm going to give today is really geared around changing our theoretical trajectory, our frameworks for evaluating and understanding Black males. And one of the problems that I think that we have in higher education and just in theoretically situating how we approach Black men and boys is that we don't have very much guidance of how we should interpret their life experience, or even what's far too often presented to us, which is their dead bodies and their corpses. So when we're theorizing through contemporary crises, I want us to think about the man not as an analytic, a perspective that's trying to guide how we think about the experiences of Black men and boys. And while there is a tendency to think about Black males from a deficit-based perspective as if they're problems, what I like to do here is situate them not as problems, but as victims of a specific kind of structural dynamic, which we call anti-Black misandry, and I'll speak about that a little later. So when we're talking about Black male studies, the first thing to understand is that it has a different theoretical orientation to how we approach and interpret the realities of Black men and boys. The first is that when we build from actual studies of colonial societies and genocidal regimes, we understand that patriarchy has historically excluded marginalized men and treated them as inferior to women of dominant racial classes. Now, this is somewhat counterintuitive to what we generally learn through pop culture and through even our general understandings of a gender through feminism. However, Black male studies takes a different view, an evidence-based study of how patriarchal societies, through things like genocide, ethnic conflicts, and wars, have actually engaged outgroup men. So if we accept Miller's argument that patriarchy has historically marginalized men that are not covered by the covenant of kinship, then we see how filial and fraternal bonds have always mitigated how men have used power over other men who belong to the group. Throughout history, such men have been perceived as threats and treated as such. So patriarchy's treatment of such men have always been more brutal and harsh than its treatment of women. But this contradictory and inconsistent feature of patriarchy has been mostly ignored in contemporary gender studies. When we look closer, we see that patriarchy has two foundational elements if we're looking at this historically, looking at actual patriarchal regimes. The first, of course, is the marginalization of women. The second, however, is the violent subjugation or surrender of non-kinship men. In Male Marginalization Revisited, Miller suggests to us that there are two fundamental elements that we have to understand here. The first is that there is a marginalization of women within kinship collectives, right? But the other is also that there's a marginalization of men over of other collectives that are outside the covenant of kinship, over which dominance is established by voluntary or violent means. Now, the implication of this definition for Miller is that patriarchy, for definition of patriarchy, is that gender cannot be understood or interpreted solely in terms of men's domination of women. This suggests that gender analysis is not simply about the asymmetry in power between men and women. A gender perspective is not only about women's issues. So to understand gender as being synonymous with women is to misconstrue or misinterpret the concept of patriarchy altogether. The point for Miller is that gender analysis cannot assume solidarity between men and women belonging to different groups of society. And this is because gender operates in conjunction with other social criteria upon which societies are organized, and that solidarity amongst men and women of groups sharing common identities and common bonds of belonging is much greater than solidarity of either men or women of groups with different identities sharing no bonds of belonging. Now, this understanding is important. It's critical because what it suggests is that there's a fundamental separation, both culturally and socially, based in the hierarchies and social organization that we have in given societies. The way that we've established or tried to interpret Black men has simply been as carbon copies of white men. We assume that Black men are just poor and more deviant white males. But what Miller is suggesting for the first time in the 1980s is that when we look at patriarchy, patriarchy is a kinship system that actually tries to do violence to men of the out group. Now, this may seem strange, but this is a well accepted fact amongst genocide scholars. The idea that outgroup or racialized males are the primary targets of conflict and lethal violence has been something that's rung true since they began studying the rise of violence and genocides at the beginning of the 20th century. Adam Jones, for instance, developed the theory of gendercide to suggest that when you're looking at low-level conflicts and genocidal killings, the killing of non-combatant men has been and continues to be the most frequent targets of mass killing and genocidal slaughter, as well as a host of lesser abuses. This means for Jones that the mass killing of males, particularly battle-age men, roughly 15 to 55, right, has roots in deep in the history of conflict between human communities, and this goes back all the way to antiquity. So what we're seeing here is that when conflicts start, when you have low-level conflicts or even racism or in racially repressive regimes, what you're looking at is how the dominant group is seeking to exterminate, if not completely eliminate, racialized men are the men of the subjugated group from the civil society altogether. Now, this has been actually studied in more recent theories. The subordinate male target hypothesis that was introduced by Jim Sedanis and Felicia Prado has made similar claims. They argue that in essence and in general, we suggest that women from both arbitrary set in groups and out groups will be subject to gender discrimination and the dynamics of patriarchy. However, they argue, and this runs contrary to how we think of intersectionality and the idea of double jeopardy, they argue that is primary outgroup males rather than outgroup females who will be the primary targets of arbitrary set discrimination. Now, while arbitrary set outgroup females will certainly suffer from the effects of arbitrary set discrimination, largely as a result of their close associations with arbitrary set outgroup males in the forms of husbands, sons, fathers, brothers, and lovers, we should expect that arbitrary set outgroup females will not be the primary targets of arbitrary set discrimination. They argue that the reason behind this expectation is that arbitrary set discrimination is primarily a form of intrasexual competition perpetrated by males and directed against males. As such, arbitrary set discrimination, and this is important, can be viewed as a form of low-level warfare directed against outgroup males. So social dominance theorists label this the subordinate male target hypothesis. Now, social dominance theory wants to argue that the ways that society is set up is around group-based hierarchy. So when you look at a society, you'll have an in group, and in that in group, you have a dominant age group where older people have more power than younger people. You have a sex group where men have more power than women. And then you have an arbitrary set group. And an arbitrary set group is the groups or the characteristics that the dominant in group, say in America, the white group, socially construct about people that are different from them. So we have this constant idea that race is a social construction, a process of otherization. Arbitrary set discrimination is naming that otherization and suggesting to us that the most gruesome forms of violence, genocide, conflict, war, etc., the most gruesome times of violence and dehumanization happen to people that we define as being outside of our moral community. So this problem, right, this problem of otherization, particularly and peculiarly affects men, racialized men. Now, Black male studies scholars have recognized this over the last few years as a problem of anti-Black misandry. And the reason that they call it misandry, the reason that this term is adopted is because what Black male studies scholars are trying to show the world is through empirical and evidence-based testing, is that when you look at an arbitrary set discrimination like racism, the male group is going to be targeted. That's why stereotypes about races most closely resemble negative stereotypes about the men of that group. So anti-Black misandry tries to show us that while we have ideas of Black men as dangerous, criminal, and rapists, and we identify these stereotypes as racist, right? When you look at the very same ideas of Black men as gender theories, say of a Black toxic masculinity, they become more acceptable. So the reproduction of these theories suggesting the anti-sociality and deviance of Black men and boys, the totality of these negative ideas, is what characterizes the racist misandry of gender theory. So to be very clear, anti-Black misandry is the cumulative assertions of Black male inferiority due to errant psychologies of lack, dispositions of deviance, or hyperpersonality traits like hypersexuality and hypermasculinity, which rationalize the criminalization, phobics, and sanctioning of Black male life. So when we ask ourselves what exactly is the kind of dynamic that we see happening to Black men and boys, why is it that the racism that they seem to experience in American society seem to be so much more lethal, so much more disproportionate than their female counterpart? It's because there's a misandric aggression that accompanies the idea of racism. It's not simply that Black people are inferior, it's specifically that the Black males of the Black group are inferior and dangerous. Hence, all Black people are inferior and dangerous. But far too often we end up over determining Black men simply by issues of criminality, deviance, and danger. And the man, not what I try to show is that while it's not novel to say that Black men are killed disproportionately higher than many other groups, including Black women or even Indigenous men and women, we often only focus on that. So we ask different sorts of questions. We are allowed to say that Black men and boys are affected by racism, but we don't think they're affected by much else, right? We walk around with the idea that the only thing that can harm a Black man is in fact a bullet. But when we look at the data, when we take a moment to actually dig into the experiences of Black men and boys, ask how they experience the world, how they suffer, we see a vastly different picture come about. And part of that picture, both historically and contemporarily, is the illumination of their sexual vulnerability. So throughout history, we've dealt with the reality that Black men were victims of rape. In my work in The Man Not, people like Lamont Edu in his work looking at the history of rape by the Portuguese in Brazil, the work of Thomas A. Foster looking at the sexual abuse and rape of Black men during slavery. These have all shown that rape was a routine, if not daily, experience of Black men during American enslavement. What we often forget, however, is that this vulnerability never went away. One of the projects that I'm working on now is actually a survivor testimony of a Black man who was raped during Jim Crow, during segregation in the 1940s. So, what we have are systems of sexual vulnerability and violence that have existed since Black men landed or were taken from Africa and put on in America. But we've ignored the fact that this vulnerabilities actually matter, that it's affected how Black men are socialized, how they perceive violence, and how they've actually experienced living in their own bodies. Now, for many people, this is a novel idea because we assume that all the rape that may have happened to Black men was perpetrated by white men. And that's certainly the case. A lot of the rape, right, of Black men during slavery and Jim Crow segregation was perpetrated by white men. But there is also the reality that white women were perpetrators of rape of Black men. In the 1940s, J.A. Rogers argued that white women set up brothels to rape and to sexually abuse Black men. That this was so common of a fact that if it was not for anti-miscegenation laws, that white women would certainly have surpassed white men in raping and sexually assaulting Black men. However, even in the work of Thomas A. Foster, where this is well documented through narratives and testimonies from enslaved Black men during the time, we have a hard time redefining and associating gender with the kind of sexual vulnerability for Black men. Said differently, the myth of the Black rapist, the idea of the Black sexual brute, is so overwhelming for the senses and sensibilities of Black people, of white people in America, that the idea that a Black man could ever be sexually vulnerable to a white woman that owns him, to a white woman that can claim that he is a rapist and get him killed, lynched, etc., it becomes unfathomable. And what ends up happening to our theory is that we can't see that sexual vulnerability is an issue of power and the fungibility that Black men have in a society that's geared towards their extermination. That we never look at different sorts of relations and configurations in social organization that allow us to see that Black men are actually not only oppressed by race, but certainly oppressed by their sex as male. So, in order to reconcile, right, this seeming contradiction between the idea of Black men as being rapists and the brute and the idea of them being victims of rape, Black male studies has tried to reorient our thinking towards a concept called phallicism. Phallicism refers to the condition by which males of subordinated racialized or ethnic groups are simultaneously imagined to be a sexual threat and predatory, while libidinally constituted as sexually desires by the fantasies and fetishes of the dominant racial group. So the racialized male is cast as the substantive social meaning of rape, while being subjugated to rape by both the male and female members of the dominant group who disown their sexual violence because the hypervisibility of the racialized male is only thought to be that of the rapist. So what phallicism is trying to do is trying to guide a seemingly inexplicable tension, if not contradiction, between the description of racialized males as grotesque and savage under repressive or murderous regimes, while simultaneously being hypersexualized as objects of desire, possession, and want. Now, under our present intersectional frames, phallicism becomes impossible. But what Black male studies is trying to do is actually highlight some of the methodological concerns that we have in deploying intersectionality in the study of Black males. Precisely, what I'm interested in is how the male category in intersectional analysis reduces Black men to privileged, oppressed peoples. So the idea that they're males somehow is situated within a gender hierarchy where them being male means, even despite the empirical evidence that they are more disadvantaged in many cases than their female counterpart, we still have to interpret them as privileged and advantaged. So what ends up happening is intersectionality denies the historical vulnerability of Black males. And the reason this is important is because this is the dominant lens that we see utilized not only in classrooms and disciplines throughout higher education, but is also utilized by recruitment and retention officers, right? People who are dealing with student affairs and dealing with Black men and male populations. So there are two things that I want to highlight very briefly that concern me about using intersectionality both as a theoretical framework and as an activist-based framework in retaining students or interpreting Black male students at colleges. The first is I want to point out the weakness of the mimetic frame that we often get with Black feminist interpretations of Black males. And the second is I want to show how intersectionality actually engages or rather tries to dismiss the evidence of greater Black male subjugation as a privilege. So the first thing is we have to really establish what's going on here, right? The dominant frame of interpreting Black men and boys in gender studies and intersectionality is through mimesis. What I mean by mimesis is the idea that we can interpret Black men as taking a certain kind of pleasure in existing social hierarchies, that because they're Black men that are heterosexual or educated, etc., that they have the same kind of aspirations for dominance and for oppression that white men do. So in other words, mimesis is the idea that we can understand Black men as lesser white men. Now, when we look at Google Scholar and actually start looking for citations on Black men and intersectionality, the first thing that pops up is Frank Rudy Cooper's article against bipolar masculinity with 205 citations, right? After that, we start moving more to cultural studies. We get Mark Anthony Neal's book, The New Black Man, is listed as having 238 citations. But the most dominant book, right, the book that is most popular in Black masculinity to this very day is Bell Hook's book, We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity with 335 citations. Now, the reason these texts are important is because this forms the majority of how people, scholars, activists, etc., are actually engaging and trying to theorize the problem of Black men, both at the retention level, the criminological level, and just in terms of genders more generally. But the problem is when we start looking at these texts, we find a lot of questionable assertions with not very much research to back them. For example, if we're looking at Bell Hook's book, We Real Cool, she asserts that Black men are violent due to patriarchy. And this is interesting because this book was written in 2004, where we overall see a decline in Black male violence, right? But societal violence more generally. And specifically, we see a sharp decline in intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide. Despite these sociological facts, however, she argues that overall the facts reveal that Black males are more violent than ever before in this nation, and that they're more likely to be violent towards another Black person who they deem less powerful. So much of Black male violence is directed towards females. Sexism and the assumption of male right to dominate often serves as a catalyst for this violence. Again, utilizing evidence-based argumentation here, this is a strange claim to make. Overwhelmingly, the violence that Black men perpetrate against other men, groups or other individuals is men. And this often happens in groups or situations, environments that have lower socioeconomic status. The number of Black women killed by Black men is disproportionate to other groups, but is much, much lower, several times lower than the kinds of violence that you find between men on men. But she continues. Bell Hooks asserts that the mimetic thesis of Black men basically explains why they act in aggressive and violent ways generally. Because she believes that male violence is a central problem in our society, she thinks that we can explain Black male violence simply as a way to mirror the styles and habits of white male violence. And this, again, is the problem, right? She thinks that we could articulate or explain, analyze Black men's decisions to become the beast, right, as a surrender to the realities they can't change. So whereas we often think of Black women having positive coping responses to racism, right? Positive responses to racism and sexism, where they develop revolutionary and reformist perspectives and consciousness, right? We see this throughout the works in Black feminist thought. We see this in Patricia Hill Collins' work, for example. Black men simply retreat into the stereotypes of their oppressor. They have no resistory tradition, right? And this is especially important how she says this, because she maintains that young Black males, particularly underclass males, often derive a sense of satisfaction from being able to create fear in others, particularly white folks. So she argues then that showing aggression is the simplest way to assert patriarchal manhood, and that men of all classes know this. As a consequence, all men living in a culture of violence must demonstrate at some point in their lives that they're capable of being violent. Now, to many people, this wouldn't resonate as a problem. We simply assume that, yes, there's a problem with male violence in society because many of the homicides committed in a given society, in America, for instance, are perpetrated by men. But what we forget to understand is that most of those homicides, that's not the majority of men. And it's certainly not the majority of Black men. The language here that Bell Hooks is utilizing, right, and this is actually something I discussed in a recent article called Decolonizing the Intersection, is directly pulled from the racist subculture violence theory that we get from people like Menachem Amir in 1971 and Wolfgang and Farrakouti in 1967. Said differently, much of the things that we're taking to be matters of fact about Black men and Black masculinity are merely the reiterations and rearticulation of racist theories from criminology, which is why many of the ways that we start engaging Black males in college or in society revolve around how we see them as deviant rather than how their experiences or their vulnerability actually form them. But this is taken on in intersectionality as well. We look at Gail Garfield's work. We look at the work of Frank Rudy Cooper. We see over and over again that Black men are thought to simply imitate, simply mime the hierarchical consciousness of white men, that they're geared for oppression, right? And this is again what Gail Garfield says even through our eyes. Even when she interviews Black men, she frames them through the works of people like Bell Hooks. So she listens to their experience and then interprets their experience through this lens of masculinity and violence. While in her other book that looks at female experience, she allows the experiences of Black women to create their own theories that she then utilizes to interpret them. So here, this is the gap. Black male studies is fundamentally interested in both the phenomenological and the sociological aspects of Black male life, not only Black male death and deviance. So when we're trying to figure out how Black men understand themselves, how Black men form their concepts of manhood, we need to listen to their experiences. And this is the kinds of break that we need from the theoretical orientation that we have right now under intersectionality. But again, part of the reason this happens is because we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what race and gender actually mean when we're talking about categories of analysis. For example, if we look at the work of Cora McConaughey and Ishmael White, we see something really interesting when we look at metagroup versus subgroup analysis. So when you look at white Americans' attitudes of violence attribution, they believe that Black people are more violent than whites and they're more violent than men and women, right? So they hold the belief that Blacks are more violent than white people, that men are generally more violent than women. But when you start breaking that down, well, what's pushing this idea of Blacks being more violent than whites, or more violent generally than men and women? You find that it's the group of Black men. Said differently, the reason that Black people are thought to be more violent is because they believe that Black men are more violent, right? They don't actually believe that Black women are more violent than white men, even though they believe they're slightly more violent than white women. So when we're talking about categories and different kinds of phenomena that we take for granted under intersectional analysis, we find that that analysis, that category that we're deploying of race, right, already comes with a certain kind of misandric stereotype and negation. The reason that you can say that race is so bad is because the majority of the violence and the negative stereotypes associated with race is in fact how people experience Black men. So what intersectionality ends up doing is co-opting the experiences of Black men into race as a general category when it's already specific. Now we see this again even when we look at something like a sexual stereotype like promiscuity. So again, Blacks are thought to be more promiscuous than whites, men are thought to be more promiscuous than women, but when you look at the subgroup analysis, again, it's Black men who are thought to be the most promiscuous. They're thought to be more promiscuous than Black women, white men, and white women. This suggests to us that, again, there's a new theoretical orientation that we need to start having towards how we're utilizing and deploying racial concepts. This means then that when we're talking about intersectionality, we have to be very, very careful in how it's trying to explain this evidence of greater male disadvantage. One of the ways that is dealt with social dominance theory, and I think this would apply to how it's engaging Black male studies, is to maintain that even if the theory can't explain the empirical sociological conditions that Black men and women exist in the United States, you can simply explain it away by reinterpreting it as a form of privilege. Now, in my book, I spent a lot of time engaging this theory of intersectional visibility, which was first introduced into the Academy in 2008. I want to read very briefly what it says and explain why it's so dangerous, and we need something like a Black male studies to reorient us into the vulnerability of Black men and boys. Purdue Vons and Eibach suggest that the oppression of subordinate group men is the product of psychological dispositions that evolved as males competed for resources in the human ancestral environment. By contrast, their model of intersexual visibility views the oppression of subordinate group men as a reflection of the general tendency in an androcentric society to view all men, both those of the dominant groups and of the subordinate groups, as more important than women. They argue that it's in fact this marginalization of women in an androcentric society that causes subordinate women to be relatively ignored as direct targets of oppression compared to subordinate men. Now, remember, intersexual visibility was an article written as a response to the overwhelming evidence produced by social dominance theorists. So the subordinate male target hypothesis says that subordinate group men are going to be the primary targets of lethal violence, extermination, and removal from society. Now, that's considered in most cases to be bad. Genocide, wars, these are generally bad kinds of violence, bad degrees, horrible degrees of violence imposed on a group. But intersection visibility theorists, because they're dealing with Black men primarily, want to suggest, well, no, it's not that this kind of violence in the society actually indicates the oppression of these groups of men. Rather, because it's androcentric, meaning it's male centered and focuses on males' experiences, we can say that patriarchal societies target and kill other groups of men because they're men and because they're more important than women. So even in these groups being killed, be it genocidal, be it police killing, be it incarceration, right, be it downward mobility, that's evidence of their privilege, right? That's evidence of them being more important than women. And this is what explains for these authors why racialized men, Black men specifically, are more often the direct targets of oppression compared to subordinate group women. Now, the problem with that is that there's a strong contradiction here. So intersectional visibility is trying to convince us, right, that violence under patriarchy is, when it's against women, is evidence of their lower status and domination under patriarchy. But the greater violence against racialized men in the very same society is not, in fact, evidence of their dehumanization or oppression, but rather their privilege as men. So this is why I argue that intersectionality, specifically the idea of intersectional visibility, acts as a genocidal logic. And we can see this even in our conversations of Black Lives Matter. We can see this in affirmative action, recruitment at the and hiring in the college level. The idea is that if, even when you look at the oppression of Black men, right, the issue is not their actual condition. It's not how much they die. It's not that they're one of the most underrepresented groups in the academy. The issue is you're not recognizing women. So recognition then becomes a counterbalance in intersectional invisibility to material oppression. As I write, if death, which is one of the most extreme forms of violence that are actually waged against racialized men in a patriarchal society, cannot be an indication of the precariousness and vulnerability of the targeted group, then dehumanization, oppression, and the idea of violence itself becomes commensurate to offense. The loss of life, especially the systematic and recurring death of specific populations, has historically occupied a noted place in the consciousness of the West, given the relationship between dehumanization and genocide, right? So the idea that you don't view people as humans, you can exterminate them. This has a very, very long relationship and philosophical tradition in Western thought. But to suggest that the deaths of Black men and other racialized males in these Western societies is a mark of privilege rather than oppression negates the very idea that these bodies have a right to life and can or should be recognized as persons by adherents of intersexual visibility. So for intersexual visibility to work, it must presume that racialized males are dehumanized, that they do in fact possess a lesser life, so that we can justify recognizing other groups over them despite their amount of suffering. But perhaps this is just too theoretical. Maybe the previous literature doesn't convince us. Well, let's look at some concrete data that perhaps establishes that there is a very real racial and sexual vulnerability to Black men and boys. So I want to talk about a few things. The first thing is, of course, the number of homicides affecting Black men in the United States, right? I think we're all familiar with the disproportionate rates of Black men dying in the US. The second, of course, is going to be the rates of imprisonment. Third is something that I think many people don't really expect, which is intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide, victimization of Black men. The next is the rates of sexual victimization. And lastly, I want to speak briefly about COVID deaths and mortality in the United States and the UK. So when we look at homicide victimization, right, we know that Black women certainly have disproportionate rates of death compared to white women. But when you're talking about homicide or the leading causes of death, uh, their numbers barely compare to the kinds of proportions that we see amongst Black men, especially in the 15 to 34 age group, right? Disproportionate to whites, but much less than that of Black men. When we look at Black men, right, remember these are the same time periods between 15 and 34, 44,000, right? So we're talking about almost 80,000 Black men, a little over 80,000 Black men being killed by homicide in the United States between 99 and 2015, right? Again, compared it to their female counterpart. So the question then becomes, yes, it's disproportionate based on race. Black women are disproportionate to white women. Black men are disproportionate to white men. But why the level? Why the degree of disproportionality? What is it about the maleness that triggers something that allows the conditions to be formulated around homicide, right? Why does this become the peculiar and particular kind of violence? But we see the same kind of disparities when we look at Black male incarceration. Again, you can look at the race between white men, Hispanic men, white females, Black females, Hispanic females. And the thing that marks out in every age group, 18 to 19, 20, 24, 25, 29, all the way to 65, is the vastly more disproportionate rate of Black male incarceration per 100,000. Again, the question is what is it about American society that seeks to eliminate or pull out, remove Black men from it? And what we see over and over again, be it homicide, incarceration, we'll get to intimate partner violence and sexual assault in a minute, is that you see that there is a disproportionate impact and an effect of these dynamics amongst Black male groups. But even when we look at intimate partner violence and homicide, going back all the way to the 1970s, and in 1975 was the first national study of intimate partner violence in the United States. These two documents show the trajectories of intimate partner homicide from 1976 to the late 1990s, right? Almost 2000. And there's ironic trends here, right? There are very ironic trends because it shows that from 1976, and you can see this both in the 2000 BGS supplement and the 1998 FBI supplement, you see that there are disproportionate rates of Black men being killed by spouses. So up to roughly 1991, you see that Black men roughly outnumber the number of Black people being killed in intimate partner violence and partner homicide. Now, I'm actually writing my dissertation for my master's of public health here, and there's simply no literature that explains this dynamic. It's documented as a dynamic, but nobody can explain why. No one knows why this is happening. The idea is simply that because Black men are weaker, and this is Wolfgang Farracuti in 67, Black women took head of household and they used violence because Black men were cheaters, they were hypersexual, so they used violence to keep them in line, right? That's the best you have to explain this dynamic. It's not until the 1980s that you start getting the Duluth model, which suggests that men are abusing for patriarchal power. Before 1982, the only idea that we have of why Black men are dying more is because they're weaker men and because Black people are more violent, right? If we even look at more contemporary studies, some of the more recent NISVS data, we see the same kind of disproportionality. We're looking at 12-month prevalence. We see, of course, that Black women have a higher prevalence than most groups besides multiracials, which, as we know in the United States, is often some kind of mixture or admixture of Blackness, right? But again, when we look at Black men, despite the fact that this data is occurring, looking at a snapshot or a prevalence between 2010 2012, something that mirrors some of the patterns of victimization that we're seeing all the way back to the 1970s, we have no attention to it. There's no idea of how to even account for sexual vulnerability. And unlike the female counterpart, Black non-Hispanic males have the highest 12-month prevalence of any groups, including even if we include multiracials, right? So it suggests to us that there is something going on with Black men and boys in the United States that makes them more susceptible to violence. Notice here, the issue here is not causal, but it's a question of what's making these kinds of violence, be it lethal, incarceration, or mass incarceration and policing, intimate partner violence, what's making these types of violence accumulate around Black male bodies? Well, Penn suggests to us that we started from the wrong avenue, right? That when they started interpreting domestic violence as a kind of violence specific to femininity and to women, that this was primarily ideological, right? That this was based really off of her jingles that she got from the Duluth model. She said that, look, when we had to start explaining women's violence towards their partners or lesbian violence or the violence of men who did not like what they were doing, they were brought back to their original undeveloped thinking that the violence is rooted in social relationships like marriage and the rights people feel entitled to within them are socially, not privately constructed. When we look at more contemporary data, we know that intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide vary with class status and neighborhood location. So if you have high levels of violence in your neighborhood, in your environment, that violence is going to be reproduced within the households. If you have early exposures to violence, if you have high rates of poverty, unemployment, alcoholism, recidivism, etc., these are cocktails for interpersonal violence. And these are not things that simply affect just Black men. As you can see from the earlier victimization studies, this affects both Black men and Black women, both as perpetrators and as victims. Again, a question of how we need to reorient and re-explain some of these empirical findings that we haven't taken up yet within the literature. But I think what's most surprising to many people is, of course, the reality of Black male sexual victimization. Black male sexual victimization and made to penetrate violence is something that popped onto the scene maybe at the beginning of the 2000s, 2010, 2012, largely because the UCR definition of rape changed in the United States. When we look at the data, we see that, of course, Black women are disproportionately affected by contact sexual violence. So that shows that there is a reality of race, class, and gender, right, having an effect on the way that Black women are made vulnerable. They have the highest 12-month prevalence. They have extremely high lifetime prevalence as well. But again, one of the things that we find is Black men have similar kind of disproportionate vulnerabilities. When you're looking at Black men who are non-Hispanic, you have extremely high levels of contact sexual violence. You have extremely high levels of made to penetrate violence, right? You have extremely high levels of non-contact unwanted sexual experiences. So again, the ways that we theorize gender, the way that we perceive that Black male bodies are actually made vulnerable to certain kinds of things, um, needs to be accounted for. We have to ask ourselves, what is it about being Black and male in the society that leaves us vulnerable to various forms of violence? And contrary to our opinions, this kind of violence is not specifically isolated to male perpetrators. When we're looking at made to penetrate violence and sexual coercion specifically, even if you look at lifetime prevalence, and remember, women do generally have a higher lifetime prevalence than men, but even if you're looking in that category, you still have to deal with the fact that there are lots of young Black men who are sexually vulnerable to female only perpetrators, especially in made to penetrate violence and sexual coercion. Now, all this is to say that these vulnerabilities are both socially, politically, and institutionally geared as being antagonistic to Black male life. But even when we look at things like a pandemic, which we would assume would be more randomly situated, we see that these disparities peculiarly affect this group as well. So Black men are simply more likely to die from COVID-19 than any other group. When we look at CDC data, census data, right, we're finding 80 per 100,000, right? Uh, this is something that's been attended to in all of the data sets. We find the same kind of thing in the UK, but again, hasn't been written about as a kind of gender vulnerability. In fact, there's been a deliberate attempt to disown the fact that men are being disproportionately affected and killed by COVID-19. And it's especially worrying because, again, when you're looking at the rates of death between white women and white men being practically equal, and Black men and and Black women, you see that it's not only a racial cause there, but there's another gender component that gives us cause for serious worry. This effect is so stark that even when we're looking at life expectancy, it's had an effect on that. So when you're looking at Black male life expectancy under COVID, you can see that the deaths of Black men and Black women have actually driven and increased the life expectancy between Blacks and whites. At the beginning of 2019, the life expectancy between Blacks and whites was decreased to 4.1 years. But by mid 2020, the life expectancy of whites to Black increased to 6 years. And look at the data. That's largely driven by the fact that non-Hispanic Black men lost 3 years of life in a mere 6 months. So even when we make this comparison, right? Let's just escape the United States for a moment, and you look at the UK, the same kind of effect happens. When you're looking at size, age structure of the population, the mortality rate for deaths involving COVID-19 was recognized to be higher amongst males of Black ethnic backgrounds at 255.7 deaths per 100,000 population, and lowest amongst white males. When you look, of course, there is the racial disparity that exists with Black females who suffered a higher rate of death of 119.8 per 100,000 population, whereas white women only suffered 52 per 100,000. But the highest rates of death amongst males still need greater attention because the data, when you adjust for age, found that for all ages, the rates of death involving COVID-19 for Black males was 3.3 times higher than that of white males for the same age group, right? While the rates of Black females was 2.5 higher, 4 times higher than that of white females, right? So here's the issue. The issue is when we study Black men and boys, we often only can comprehend parts of their experience. We don't see them as vulnerable groups. We see them as a vulnerable kind, a vulnerable criminal, a Mike Brown, a Trayvon Martin to death. We see them as largely existing as political entities that suffer from racism, and that racism largely leads to their extermination or loss of life. But what we see through the data, what we see through their own experiences, what we see over and over again, just in the debates that we're having around gender in the academy, is that there's a gross reduction of their life and experience to their dead bodies. There's not a question of their victimization. There's not a question of their sexual abuse. There's not a question of how they've been resilient against these forms of oppression and victimization. There's no focus on the fact that they're the most progressive political group in the United States, or that they surpass Black women in some measures of gender equality, or that they maintain extremely persistent and novel notions of equality and humanism, despite their experiences in America and downward mobility. These positive aspects of Black male life are never taken as the kernel kernels of theorization or the kernels of actually waging new academic projects into what Black men and boys not only already are, but could be even more in the future. Rather, we focus on the kind of dilapidated debates about whether or not they're privileged or if they're dangerous or if they're abusive, etc. And at no point while we're having these debates at the college level, at the community college level, at the elite institution level, are we asking the fundamental factor of what is the kind of environments, what's the type of abuse, what is the sociological condition that's driving them to act in this way? Said differently, we assume the fault of Black men and boys resides in an ontological problem, who they are and what they define themselves or Black masculinity as, rather than the kinds of environments that we find many Black men and Black boys to be in. Early kinds of sexual experiences, early sexual abuse, early physical abuse, societal neglect, and broken homes. Now, this quite differs for other groups where the first thing we ask if a white woman commits a crime is what happened to her, right? We're interested in what caused the individual of this group to somehow be broken or distorted. But we assume that brokenness and distortion in the idea of being Black and male itself. Black male studies is making that intervention, is introducing evidence-based accounts now how we think about and deploy every category that we have previously and trying to look at how the experiences that Black men have now in our world simply do not fit with previous theories. So thank you very much for listening to the presentation. And I hope that has given us something to think about, not only in terms of theory, but in terms of how we change and think about the kinds of vulnerabilities that Black men actually suffer in our society and within our classrooms today. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Again, Dr. Curry, I was just taking pages of notes for that wonderful presentation. Every time I hear you, I learn something anew about Black male studies. And thank you again for that wonderful presentation. And so at this time, what we're going to do is we're going to go and open it up for questions. Before we start taking questions from the audience out there, we want to know if there are any questions from the panel for Dr. Curry. Any questions from the panel? Are there any questions for the panel? Any questions?
Good to see you, Dr. Curry. And, you know, I always love your work, your presentations. We've had many individual and private conversations about it. So I think the last time we talked about some of your work, I was in the car eating a In-N-Out burger there in Dallas. So, and literally sat there talking to you in the parking lot for like an hour about some of these very things. So that takes me to some of the things we talked about that night, but also takes me to my most recent publication came out last week. It's a book that focuses on alternative student affairs development frameworks. So with my field being higher ed and student affairs, for years and years and years, even going back to when I was in a higher ed program, we always studied these seminal authors who provided us with these theories and these theoretical frameworks that were also very, very white and also very, very normed on white populations. And I just always felt like these theories never reflected who we were, not only as Black men, but just as diverse people and diverse populations. So with that said, given your presentation and what you said, you talked about the methodological concerns, and in our field, one of the seminal works was by Dr. Jim Sherrick. Years ago, he had a piece called Coloring Epistemologies, and he talked about racism in education and how from the very, very onset, our epistemological understandings were so grounded in racism and issues involving race. So you talked about methodological concerns. So where do we begin? Where do we enter? Where do we enter in this conversation about the methodological concerns related to Black masculinity?
Oh, that's a great question, Fred. I think and I was actually missing the In-N-Out burger because I'm in Scotland. They don't use seasoning. So colonize all the Asians still can't use seasoning. No, I think where we intervene is has to be very, very directed and deliberate. The recent piece that I just published, I put it up on ResearchGate, Decolonizing the Intersection, really shows concretely that there is a insidious relationship between feminism, Black feminism, and gender studies, and criminological theories of Black men. So when we're looking at things like Wolfgang and Farah Cootie's work, which is the subculture violence theory 67, we look at Miniature Mamir's work, these theories, he wrote The Patterns of Forcible Rape in 1971. These works assumed that Black men were more hyper masculine, had a more deviated and violent, sexually aggressive culture. And that was the basis of many of the theories and thinking that we get from people like Bell Hooks. It's almost, Miniature Mamir's work is almost verbatim articulated by bell hooks. It's poor underclass men who embrace this idea of violence, who want to create fear, because this is the subculture theory, right? Miniature Mamir did his dissertation on Wolfgang and Farrakouti. So the only thing he added to that was, whereas Wolfgang and Farrakouti focused on homicide, he focused on rape. So you see how that lends itself to like the work of Susan Brown Miller, to people like, Holmes and Williams in the Second Assault. When white feminists were trying to explain rape, Miniature Mamir did one good thing. He took the idea of the myth of the Black rapist away, because Miniature Mamir's dissertation showed that most rape occurs intraracially within the group, right? But then white feminists like Susan Brown Miller, like Holmes and Williams started saying, well, then we need to start analyzing Black men as hyper rapists because they have higher rates of sexual assault than the white race. So criminologists like Lynn A. Curtis started trying to influence policy in DC. And this is where we start getting this kind of super predator mythology that comes up a little later in the 90s. He starts formulating in the mid 70s. And this work by Lynn Curtis is actually cited, this idea of compensatory masculinity is actually cited in The Second Assault by Williams and Holmes. And guess who cites The Second Assault? Kimberly Crenshaw in Mapping the Margins. That's her argument that Black men use rape to control and discipline Black women in the Black community. Now, that for me, that's just an intellectual history project, but it shows that the assumptions behind the categories of Black masculinity are fundamentally tied to ideas of criminology and deviance. So the reason we keep getting the same kind of arguments, why is it every time we talk about Black men, we're talking about domestic violence? Why are we always talking about sexual assault? Is because we started off with this history that geared us towards looking at Black masculinity not only as deviant, but as more sexually aggressive. And that's a methodological problem. Because when we keep saying, as you know, even in your work, where you keep saying that, look at the resilience of these Black men, look at the gifted and talentedness of these Black men, right? That are not being affected by these kinds of stereotypes, this kind of aggression and violence that you keep pitching us in Black feminism. Well, that's the exception. They don't matter. Then I come in and say, okay, well, let's start looking at rates of violence in our group. How do you explain that these Black men are also being sexually victimized? How do you explain that they're experiencing child sexual abuse and child physical abuse? Oh, well, it doesn't matter. See, nothing sociologically matters to how the category of the behavior of the group happens, because you've already defined them as deviant and criminal prone. So in order for us to change the method, we have to go back and start having these debates about why are we making these assumptions about the group and the category. And I think that Black male studies right now has been the only intervention into that debate, because intersectionality is so dominant that's even trying to say, well, let's go back and look at the intellectual history of where your ideas come from.
So,
right? And I think that's the only way that we can change that.
That's that is part of it. My second question is, how do we start to reframe and retrain our scholars, academics, those who see intersectionality as the go-to theory? So how do we start to reframe, retrain, or get them to seek some different theories that are in that liminal space that doesn't put them at a particular place and space, but in between, to allow them to theorize without all of the noise?
No, listen, I think this is where, we have to go back to what Du Bois was doing. We have to employ evidence-based thinking. The reality, as you and I both know, when you look at the data, intersectionality can't explain those disparities, right? It just can't. So what I think has to happen is there has to be a direct empirical challenge to the kinds of outcomes that intersectionality claims is going to exist versus what actually does exist. And I think a concrete thing about this is, it's funny because, I recently published an article that's coming out in Oxford Handbook, where, Kimberly Crenshaw has been pushing this idea of, Black women's sexual vulnerability to police, right? Something that we need to attend to. Nobody has a problem with that. It's true. But the thing that's not even mentioned in any of the reports is that Black men have ongoing court cases trying to get cops convicted for sexual assault and rape because of police stops and frisking, right? So the question becomes, well, if this is what we're attending to, sexual violence, how is that Black men are always excluded from sexual violence and sexual assault in intersectionality reports? Why are they never seen as victims of intimate partner violence when we see their victimizations comparable to their female counterpart? Why are they never articulated as victims of rape, right? These are all questions that we need to start seriously asking of intersectionality, because despite the data, despite the advance of the archives, we are not looking at Black men as sexually vulnerable. And I think the second thing we have to do, and this is where I think we really have to start reformulating and challenging these intersectionality scholars, is how is it that you have an article written in 2008 that concedes and explains that Black men are going to be more direct targets of oppression and disadvantage, things that we see empirically, and then reinterpret that as privilege?
Mm.
Like we don't, there's not any other group, be it genocide or disadvantage, where you would say that even though you're one of the most underrepresented groups, you need to stay that way because anything we do only perpetuates patriarchy. We would take it as being we would take it as being offensive, at least from a public health perspective, to say that 96% of a population is disproportionately affected by a certain kind of violence, like police shootings, but you should do nothing to help them simply because they're male. Right? This framework and these arguments that we're utilizing under the guise of intersectionality simply doesn't fly for any other group but Black men. So I think we need to start asking ourselves, and we need to start challenging these scholars on how can you see such high rates of disproportionality and mortality associated with Black men, and then rationalize that away as if the only group that can be talked about are non-Black male groups.
Brother Curry, so here's a question. So we know one of the problems that I have had with intersectionality, particularly as I look at it coming through the lens of my gifted Black males, is that, you know, I would always say, you know, when you problematize intersectionality, looking at it through the lens of Black males, gifted Black males, you know, they're gifted, they're Black, they're male, all these identities intersecting, but the main problem is that those intersecting identities sit on a white plane. So
Absolutely.
how do we start to reconceptualize, reimagine what we think about our different intersecting identities without necessarily using intersectionality? How do we think about ourselves and our identities outside of that white plane or white racial frame, as Fagan says?
As Joe would say, well, I think two things. I think one, the empiricists have a really easy way of doing this because they could just test the interaction between the variables, right? And when you, I mean, even when you look at some of Crenshaw's analysis on suspensions, you notice that the way she disaggregates is that she's always trying to read the racial effect as an intersectional effect. So she'll separate, like she'll look at the rate of suspension between white girls and Black girls, and then she'll say, "Oh, look, Black girls are suspended at a 5% rate." And Black boys are only is suspended at a 3% rate compared to white boys, right? Oh, look at this intersectional analysis. That means that Black girls are more vulnerable. But as you and I both know, you didn't do anything intersectional. You just disaggregated based on gender and test the race effect, right? Race is the independent variable, right? Like it's a sleight of hand, right? So one of the ways that I think that we can start getting exactly to your point is showing how what we call intersectional analysis is really resting on this racism, this white supremacist plane, which is why variables are going to have different effects, right? So even if we're doing some kind of modeling, we should then see if we're correct that there are going to be larger impacts and larger associations associated with race rather than gender in some of these cases. I think the other thing that we have to do is that we have to just start being honest about why some things seem to be untestable. And here's what I mean by this very clearly, Fred. We have no problem testing the disparities between white men and white women. White women have made their whole careers out of just testing their disadvantage compared to white men, even though it's minimal compared to every other racial group, because they disproportionately benefit from marrying and having children by white men.
True.
But when we start talking about Black men and Black women, somehow we can't figure out how to test gender effects within the group.
Mm.
We can study gender effects all day between white people, but when we talk about Black people, because it doesn't fit in there, because you know which way that trend's gonna go, right? So if you start adding maleness to that scale, you're gonna see a downward slope. You're gonna see negative skews, right? But somehow, despite the empiricism, and this is what was so good about Chetty and Hendricks' piece in Downward Mobility and Economic and Wealth, because they showed that there's a clear downward trend when you start looking at Black men compared to every other group. So the way that we reformulate this is, again, evidence-based. The theory simply can't account for the reality. And when you look at the ideology behind it, there's experiences that Black men are sharing. There's realities that Black practitioners and professors are seeing that need explanation that simply hasn't been made available by intersectionality as of yet.
Another question for you. So in my area of research, and as you mentioned, Dr. Curry, my whole career has been based on me trying to tell trying to disrupt the deficit modeling. All we've ever heard about Black males back when I was coming along in '97 working on my dissertation. So there was nothing out there that gave a really positive spin about Black males. So I'm like, well, you know, we spent all of our time looking at Black males who are not doing well, not successful, not. So that whole deficit modeling thing. So I chose specifically to focus on academically gifted and talented African-American males in post-secondary institutions. So moving from deficit modeling to asset modeling in my particular area of our sphere of influence in my field in education was to focus on the gifted and talented. What is the asset modeling in Black masculinity and Black male studies?
It's a different epistemology. So one of the reasons that I like your work so much is that I think that it shows not only the resilience and positive coping strategies that Black men have, right? But it shows that there are strategies that Black male culture has adapted to actually create academically successful, positive, engaged, right, social systems of contact. And again, this is why I pointed out, as you know, with that old Hunter and Sellers argument, right, where it drew out this argument in the 1990s that look, when we're talking about Black women, suddenly Black women are oppressed by the same systems, and they're like, let's create Black girl magic, right? Look at all these positive things they can resist. When we talk about Black men, is reactionary, it's all decadent. And what I think the asset modeling that you utilize do is it shows, here's one example, here's a case study of a positive resistance based, right, epistemology that Black men are utilizing to make sense of, cohere, and actually deal with and understand their world. It doesn't create a fatalism. It doesn't mean that because Black men recognize the depths of their oppression that they can't figure some kind of way out of it, or they can't certainly deal with it in positive ways. What Black male studies is doing is utilizing, larger data sets, right? Looking at Black men's attitudes about gender, Black men's beliefs about equality, Black male resistance throughout time, Black male political theory from Newton all the way to to Martin Luther King, is showing that Black men have looked at oppression and created more humane and humanistically oriented ways of dealing with the problem of white racism and their specific gender oppression. Those things are not articulated as such right now. If you're reading the work of Malcolm X or Huey P. Newton, they don't highlight his humanism. They don't highlight his global perspectives about oppression and diagnosis of tyranny. They say, oh, he's a Black man, or he's just talking about race. Again, that's not what Newton's talking about at all. Most of his essays are talking about poor Black men who are incarcerated or can't find employment, and how that creates an existential crisis through things like homicide. So it means that we have to completely recondition and reformulate how we see and engage the voices of Black men throughout history, and even these kind of classical texts. So I think that the asset model, even the more positive associated epistemology, the idea of the man not, right, the negation transforming Black men into apatriarchal, positive, and progressive masculinities, the idea of multiple masculinities, right? These are all aspects of Black male studies that articulate us beyond kind of the fatalism that we see systematically in the United States.
One of the things you just mentioned, I completed this op-ed piece a couple of months ago, and it's titled "How and Where We Enter," and I was basically talking about the dual pandemics we're dealing with in this country: the pandemic of race, and of course COVID-19. And I offer these seven propositions for faculty, higher ed faculty, since that's my lens, my field.
Right.
And one of the first proposition is individuals outside of the Black diaspora can have an opinion about our experiences. They can have an opinion about our narrative, but they should never have dominion over our narrative. Mm-hmm. And so often I see that white voice is privileged to even explain the Black experience or existence. So I don't know, a lot of what you said is just kind of touched upon, it's like there are so many people outside of the Black diaspora explaining who we are. And do you see that in Black male studies as well?
Absolutely. I mean, because listen, I'll use my field as an example, philosophy, right? Philosophy doesn't care about evidence. So the people who determine what Black men are basically everyone who's not a Black man. Right. And, we've talked about this kind of dynamic for years, that no matter how much evidence you have, no matter how many data sets I bring, the fact that, literally in a few weeks, I'll have an MPH that's looking specifically at epidemiology and these trends of violence, that's not convincing to a philosopher. So the people who drive the discussion are largely white feminists or white liberals who have negative deficit-based models or understandings of Black men. You have groups of Black feminism or Black male liberals or progressive who side with white feminist ideology, and that's the dominant voice, despite the fact that there's never been a book or article written on Black men besides the work that I've done in the field. And more recently, George Yancey's kind of taken up this question. So there's no one that actually studies Black men. There's nobody that has any kind of background in social science, but there's all these assertions about Black men despite what the evidence actually says. So that's a great example of that. It creates a consensus model of understanding Black men within various fields. And I think this holds, more largely too. I mean, the pieces that determine what Black men are largely blog pieces, like that David Young piece, Black men are the white men of the Black race. That makes no sense. None of the data supports any of that. None of the attitudinal studies support any of that. Even the domestic violence literature that he tries to draw upon doesn't support what he claims. But nonetheless, that blog was invited to Bell Hooks Institute. He did some keynotes at Morgan State University. This is the embarrassing level of rigor required to say something negative about Black men in the academy. And you have dozens of scholars who are leading thinkers, internationally and nationally known for their work on Black men, that never get invited to the table to debate these issues out. But if somebody posts a blog, even that 538 data that came out around the election, right, saying that Black men were turning to Trump, right? We have a forthcoming article on that. We actually disaggregated it. They lumped in Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black men to get that negative effect. So why would you lump in Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black men? Right? We don't do that, but that's what they did. So that's what created the perception. When you pulled Hispanic Black men out, non-Hispanic Black men and non-Hispanic Black women, there were no significant associations with Trump voting for Trump. So I mean, and look, even the Pew data had like a margin of error of like 9.6 plus or minus. How are these things passing muster? Right? Like how is it that this is being given to a public, and even with that kind of empirical flaw, it's being picked up by everybody. Everybody got to get their 10 minutes in the sun because they were trying to say that Black men were overwhelmingly turning conservative. Not true, right? Not true. I think it was like 87%, almost 90%, some ridiculously high percentage of Black men voted Democratic despite the candidates, but we still get pitched as if we're somehow in line with white people, right? Because remember, for the last two elections, we've had white women in majority vote for Trump. So this has no explanation. This is just negative sentiment towards Black men. And it's something that we have to control, because if Black men are not determining or not debating or not defending their narrative with evidence, right? Not just to do it, but if they're not defending it with evidence, then what is it that Black male scholarship, be it in higher ed, philosophy, sociology, et cetera, what is it supposed to express? If we're not actually challenging the negative stereotypes, then we have to fall in line. And that's why I think you have so much deficit-based and pathological work just asserting over and over again that Black men are bad, Black men are hypermasculine, Black men are sexist, despite not producing any data to support that besides citing bell hooks. It's embarrassing. No other group would be allowed to be framed in such a way by an author like Bell Hooks, who uses no citations to talk about their attitudes, their proclivities, and their aspirations, unless it's Black men. There's not a single group that I think we could name in any of the academic literature that's allowed to be discussed and interpreted in that way with no evidence. And it really speaks to the dehumanized status of Black men, not only in America, but throughout the academy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bonner. We do have some questions out there, and this is from anonymous attendee. This is for Dr. Curry. It says, can't dehumanization of Black men and extreme violence towards Black men in the name of male-on-male competition both be true versus one thing or the other, especially since we see violent male towards male competition globally, not just in the Western world? So that's the question.
That's an interesting question. I think it really depends on where you come down on Sedanius' invariance hypothesis. So Sedanius argues that men of any group in the world are going to be more prone to violence and maintenance of hierarchy because they're going to be more interested in protecting their group from invading males, right? Alien male threats. So he suggested this is one of the ways that we can see something like the subordinate male target hypothesis actually be true and that make evolutionary sense, right? I happen to disagree a little bit because remember what you're doing is kind of a selection bias. So you're absolutely right that when you're looking at the most extreme forms of violence, it is male on male competition. But that male on male competition is happening amongst an extremely small percentage of males within all of those groups. So if you take something like homicide or rape, you're talking about like 1% of the total population of adult black men in the United States, right? Even less than 1%. So what does that mean? Does it mean that most rape that is committed by men? Absolutely. Most homicide committed by men? Absolutely. But the majority of men don't commit homicide or rape, right? Because you're talking about upwards of 99% of men don't do those things. So I don't know if it could be reduced down simply to maleness, right? And that's my suspicion because what that does, what invariance does, is it says, oh, well, we can expect certain kinds of behaviors, maybe inclinations, but when you're starting to look at some of these other things like the gender egalitarianism or the humanism or the politically equal attitudes, well, how do you explain that? If it's just about men competing with other men, why do they have attitudes that seem to be anti-conflictual? How do you get like a Martin Luther King, right? How do you get a Gandhi? Why do are these people exceptional? But why are they more exceptional than the small half a percentage of or half of the 1% of men who actually participate in violence, right? So again, I think we have to be very careful about what we're doing and how we make generalizations. I think that certainly both can be true. But again, I would like to explore some of the other aspects of how we think about Black men and what inclinations are, because largely that argument rests on a biological and evolutionary assumption.
Thank you so much for that. And we have another question. Do you think, Dr. Curry, Black males in America suffer from intergenerational trauma? Do you believe Black males in America suffer from intergenerational trauma?
Absolutely. I think all the evidence that we have suggests that. I mean, even if you're looking at some of the early ethnographic works of Black male children during Jim Crow, like the 1940s, et cetera, you see repetitive forms of violence and neglect. I think that, I mean, one of the sources that I constantly cite is the Mark of Oppression by Cardinier and Avesi, where they noticed that Black boys were being sexually abused between the ages of 7 and 9. So these are things that we've had in our communities, especially our some of our most deprived economic communities, our economically deprived communities, I'm sorry, for quite some time. And we don't have an outlet. We don't have treatment. We don't even see that Black boys could be victims of physical and child sexual abuse. We don't see that Black men really suffer from depression. These are things that we just don't even acknowledge. So if we're not acknowledging it, I would venture to say that these are real problems that we need to deal with, and we need to really kind of situate at the forefront of starting to focus more on Black male life and Black male understanding and aspiration, rather than reducing Black men and boys down to their inevitable deaths.
Excellent. All right, the questions keep coming in. Let's see, we have another one. This question says, do many of the theories about Black male violence come from the studies about the Black Panther movement of the 1960s?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are trying to apply subculture violence theory to the Black Panther Party as a form of gangsterism, right? So many white criminologists were trying to see the Black Panther movement as gang activity and try to explain it that way. But no, in the sense that they basically were studying poor white boys. So like Cohen's book in 1955 was all about poor white boys and deviants. And then when you added race to that, racial inferiority theories came up with these kind of more dangerous, violent, homicidal subcultures. So it's associated with it, but it's not necessarily the same thing.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And the next question is from Dr. Lynn. Dr. Curry, please talk about the implications of your work for how we increase Black male success in higher education.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. I think there's a few things. The first is that we need affirmative action programs that are specifically dedicated to the recruitment and retention of Black males. This includes not only articulating the specific kinds of disadvantage that we find of Black men and boys compared to their female counterparts in the white groups, but it's also an explanation of the larger societal vulnerabilities. I think this is well within, the spirit of affirmative action as an executive order that's being practiced, on most college and university campuses. But I think it also extends it to the spirit of Title IX, which is very rarely utilized towards males. The case of Black males, specifically with the data and the rates of sexual violence, sexual assault, and gender-specific harassment and stereotype, makes Title IX a very suitable venue to actually try to decrease some of the sex/gender disparity that we find not only between Black men and Black women, but also between Black men and other male groups within colleges and universities, right? And I think here the perfect model, of course, would be some of the programs that they use for advance and other kinds of recruitments, et cetera, for Black women and other female groups compared to their white female counterpart. I think the other thing we have to do is that we have to insist that we utilize different paradigms which do not assist on the pathological orientation towards Black men and boys in recruitment and student affairs. Far too often, many of the recruitment videos and of the diversity training we see is predominantly intersectional. It's talking in language of implicit bias, it's talking in language of psychoanalytic tropes, and it's talking in language of female disadvantage. And no one's denying that women are certainly disadvantaged to some male groups, but the data overwhelmingly shows that they're not disadvantaged compared to Black and brown male groups. So that means that we have to start reorienting how we're training people and what we're actually trying to do in terms of outreach, specifically in terms of retainment, right? How are we addressing some of the issues of climate? Because what we're going to see on college campuses, going along with the data of sexual assault, is that you're going to find higher rates of both blaming and trying to convict Black men under Title IX, and you're also going to find higher rates of victimization of Black men to sexual assault on the very same campuses. So that provides a very unique and tenuous position that I think we have for lots of Title IX officers and departments, because they have to start recognizing victimization and perpetration go hand in hand with Black men on these campuses, right? So yeah, I think those are just a few ideas that would work. But I think they have, I'm always into ideas that have a evidentiary base because they're utilizing existing structure, right? And of course, the most relevant thing is hire more Black male faculty that are sympathetic and studying Black male studies. The reality of the situation is that there is a fight going on in the academy between what Black male studies is saying and what everybody else wants to say, right? And because Black male studies says so much overwhelming evidence, there has not been any published criticism of the theory, right? People talk bad about it, but they can't disprove it because the evidence is overwhelming. So the question that I think, I mean, I don't think this is something that's going to be won in departments. I think this is something that presidents and administrators are going to have to pay attention to and say, well, look, if the evidence is saying this, and this is the only theory explaining the evidence, how can we take this up to try to change our numbers? And once those numbers change, once you start seeing that is both effective and efficacious, both theoretically and practically, I think this is the model that we'll have to use moving forward, because we can't keep overlooking both the mental health aspect. This is something that William A. Smith discusses with racial battle fatigue and racial misandric aggressions. We can't keep overlooking the downward turn of Black men out of higher ed, and we certainly can't keep overlooking the way that most departments are gearing Black men to reject and not want to participate in academic life. I think Black male studies is a reasonable answer to all those things.
Excellent, excellent. The questions are just coming in, so you guys let me know how we're doing on time. But as they come in, I'm gonna just give them to Dr. Curry. This question is a statement and a question. It sounds as though we need to move from just patriarchy to white male patriarchy as the dominant group. So that somebody is probably asking, should we just move away from patriarchy to white male patriarchy as the dominant group? Should we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that would be more appropriate. I mean, all the literature prior to Black feminism in the 1980s never referred to Black men as a patriarchal group. Again, this is what I'm saying so interesting about being a philosopher is that when you go back and look at when they started introducing the idea of Black men as patriarchs, the first time I found in white feminist thought was 1975. And that was because they said Black men weren't patriarchs and only could enforce patriarchal power or act on patriarchal power through oppressing women through the act of rape. So that's actually the second assault. That's the first time I found that ever discussed. And what's interesting about that is that at the end of the book, they say this whole theory, they call it race sex stratification. This whole theory of race sex stratification, or the idea that patriarchy exists in racial groups and not just the white dominant group, is based on an idea of compensatory masculinity, where Black men are trying to compensate by imitating white men. And they say it literally has no evidence. It's just a theory, right? So the most dominant theory that you have about patriarchy even existed, and this is what's so important, the idea that patriarchy even exists within racial subgroups didn't even come about till the mid 1970s. And the only reason it came about was because it said that Black men and Mexican, it was only two groups, Black Americans and Mexican Americans, only because those two groups were disproportionately rapists. It had nothing to do with the power they had nothing to do with their belief structure. The idea was that black men and brown men rape more than white men, hence they're enforcing patriarchy. And that got translated from the 1970s into the kind of intersectional dictum, which is that patriarchy exists in every racial subgroup. But there's no evidence for that. There's no study, there's no document, there's no test that's ever that I found, and all I do is read this stuff, that I've ever found to show that patriarchy is a universal trait in a racial subgroup. Because the whole point of being a racial subgroup, at least in the 60s and 70s, was that you weren't patriarchs because you were feminine and inferior to the dominant white male patriarch, right? That's why hypermasculinity in the 1960s and the 1980s was thought of as a female personality trait. It wasn't these men were actually like hyper men. It was that these men didn't have fathers. They imitated the mother. The mother gave them female characteristics and traits. So they ended up growing up as men with female personalities. They rejected it. They hated everything female and tried to overcompensate, right? It's just overcompensation disorders, right? It's all based on psychoanalysis. None of this is based in real facts. And that's what I'm saying is so dangerous, that we've taken on these ideological structures and we've started interpreting all aspects of violence, just like they did. Disproportionate amounts of sexual assault, disproportionate amounts of intimate partner violence, disproportionate amounts of hyper masculinity, right? Or bad boy street culture all become evidence of patriarchy. Whereas for them, patriarchy has always been about power, wealth, surplus, militaries, etc. Right? At best, black men are a carbon copy. It's not in line with the previous literature.
That's excellent. Excellent. This is learning so much. Okay. Next question we have, let's see, deals with, I believe, Black males studies. So to Dr. Curry, in the practical sense, do you see Black male studies as a standalone academic discipline or as a discipline existing within a framework like African American studies or ethnic studies?
I think Black male studies is a paradigm, so I guess it would have to coexist. But I guess one of the things that I found is that in many Black studies department or ethnic studies departments, it's so overdetermined by a certain kind of gender politic that it doesn't even try to test this theory. So I've found extreme hostility from people who do Black studies with degrees in English, for example, right? That are not willing to test or even historically examine the gender category or the notion of the feminine or masculinity. So yeah, my hope would be that this would be something that pushed Black studies forward, that would push critical race theory forward. But as you know, as usually what usually happens is that I'll get old and then I'll die, and somebody will go back and read it and test it even more and be like, well, this guy's right. You know, I mean, I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but often that's what happens. The reality of the situation is that there is no evidence for many of the theories that we believe right now. Right. And as much as we like psychoanalysis coming out of liberal arts, psychoanalysis is a European theory that just doesn't have evidence. So it's at best, the evidence is anecdotal and clinical, right? It is not a group-based societal framework where you could study people's unconscious. So until Freud becomes empowered to study all that stuff and not interpret it, the best thing we have is social science. That's why we have data. And in that world where we have data and we can actually see how people behave, Black male studies gives us the best empirical account of how Black men both understand and experience the world, right? And I think that it's an especially important as a corrective to take back some of the distorted frameworks that we're getting, even coming out of Black African American or Africana studies about Black men and boys, right? Our job is to make sure we get it right. And in a world where we're just taking on dogma and not questioning where that dogma comes from, the best we could do is use evidence-based theories and empiricism to refute the flawed theories.
Dr. Francis,
Go ahead.
Dr. Curry, when you look at, though, the history of Black organizations, and there's a lot of discussion about Black churches, right? And the history of kind of conflict between Black men and women in the church, and the Black
Absolutely.
womanists who are womanist theologians talk about the exclusion of Black women from the pulpit. And from other leadership roles in the church, and the subjugation of Black women. And they also talk about, and there's a lot of Black feminists also talk about the exclusion of Black women from leadership roles within the movement that was tied to the church and so on. So, there's some evidence to suggest that that within Black organizations and Black social movements, that there have historically been a kind of male domination, and that Black women, and that part of the reason that Black feminism, womanism in different fields has sort of come about it was because of that subjugation and that power dynamic, that uneven power dynamic. So, and I, as a Black religious person myself, I've seen evidence of that. So,
Yeah,
I
sure.
think in that regard, I can connect with some of the stories and experiences of Black womanist and Black feminist thinkers in that regard. What do you think about that?
So a few things, right? The Black church becomes a kind of symbol for the Black community writ large. And we have to remember these are Christian traditions that are extremely androcentric. So if someone made that argument, I'd say you're absolutely right. Because in Christian churches, just as in the SCLC, you had the same kind of structure. Male domination, receiving the charismatic preacher, receiving a message from God through revelation that gives it to the people. I have no problem. That is a diagnosis of what happened in Christian churches. Does that hold for whole movements? Does that hold for poor working class Black people who didn't attend church? Does you see what I'm saying? I have absolutely no problem because context is important. Absolutely correct. But does it hold for the whole movement? So if you look at SNCC, the idea there is you're coming from Michelle Wallace that this, the position, the most appropriate position of women is prone. You get the testimony of people like, Joyce Ladner. You get Mary King writing her biography. Well, that's not what Stokely meant at all. He made it as a joke, and he actually supported women's rights. That this was a womanist organization. This was about gender egalitarianism, right? That he's been framed in a certain way by Black feminist thought, right? The same way that we get some of these kind of half tropes. The idea that Sojourner Truth says that Black men are just as bad as the slave oppressors, but then don't follow up with the idea that but Black women don't know anything, so let's just listen to white women, right? Like, I have no problem with making the criticism of places where there is in fact disproportionate or asymmetrical male leadership. I have two problems though. One, is it writ large? Does it represent the whole group? And two, here's the question: does Black male leadership in the movement constitute patriarchy? It may constitute an aspiration. It may constitute Black men wanting to lead. But if you're looking at the things that are happening in the 1960s, every single document, social science, segregationist, think back to John Dollar's work on Caste and Class in a Southern Town. Every document written sociologically from 1930 to 1988 was written about Black men. Every single document identified Black men as a threat. So if we take Black feminism seriously, would we not expect Black men to then organize to respond to the threats based on their identity? And if we do, then why then does it become a mark of patriarchy for Black men who are working class, uneducated, outside of the middle class, outside of SCLC, which was a middle class aspirant, to do the same thing they say Black feminists did? Right. And see, this is, you see what I'm saying though, Dr. Lynn? At what point is it a blanket assertion? Is all Black male organizing for political power in and of itself de facto oppressive? And if we say it's not, then what other conditions, and this is Elaine Brown's point, right? This is Kathleen Cleaver's point. In a world where you're dealing with cops and you're dealing with police violence and you have Black men who are veterans that fought in wars coming back to fight for civil rights, why would you not expect the Black men to take on a paramilitary role, to be on leadership? We saw this with Robert F. Williams with the Black Armed Guard, right? We saw this with the Black Panther Party. And then you saw the majority of the membership were women. This is Elaine Brown's pushback against the feminist narrative that it was all male leadership, it was all misogynistic, etc. So all I'm suggesting is there's never wholesale dismissal of any theory or experience, but there is the problem of whether or not the generalizations that come from looking at SCLC, the Black Panther Party, the Civil Rights, can stand in for all of Black history. And that there's not some nuance about why Black men in some cases should be political leaders, or why in some cases the idea of the coalitional logic of intersectionality don't work for Black men. Like, for example, that you think Black men are rapists. White women don't work too well with Black men in coalitional building. So then how does an intersectional coalitional mark work when you demonize and criminalize Black males? Could that perhaps be a reason that they haven't joined in the coalitions that we see being accepted post civil rights? Right? These are all very simple facts that we can answer empirically, but we choose not to do it because we have this overarching narrative. Right? No one would deny that there have been ills and wrongs to women. No one would deny there wouldn't be ills and wrongs and exclusions to Black women. Not Black male studies would never make that claim. The question is, do those exclusions, do those injuries and harms constitute the overarching structure of patriarchy that by default means that all Black men imitate and aspire towards patriarchal dominance?
And I think the point too around there's social dominance that you might see, like, for example, in a church setting,
Absolutely.
but does that translate to decreased economic opportunities or other types of right? So I think that's a good point, that even if there is sort of patriarchy within a particular setting, in a Black setting or Black organization, that it doesn't translate to these other indications that we see in terms of ability to get a job, ability to work or survive, and all these types of things. So
Yeah.
Good point. I also think it's important.
Dr. Lynn, I would also
the point about Black male studies. I'm curious about that, because as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking maybe we do need departments of Black male studies that are separate from Black studies, for the reasons that you point out, because I've seen that same thing in Black studies departments, where there's a refusal to really recognize the specific conditions of Black men and the role that gender really plays in that.
Yes. But if I could read one more time, it's not only that, even if you say that there is Black male leadership and we make that akin to patriarchy, I've said it 100 times, if Black men were patriarchs, then they're the dumbest patriarchs in history. Because none of the markers of patriarchy. So there are two markers of patriarchy that we generally study associated with whites: hostile sexism, which we understand is misogyny, right, where you can do damage, harm, and violence to women, right? That's not only physical, but it's economically structural, right? This is why white men generally have more wealth, et cetera, than white women. And there's benevolent patriarchy or benevolent sexism. So this is the idea of why white women have the longest life expectancy in America, why they have some of the highest trajectories in education and social mobility upwards. If Black men controlled any of those things, why would they put themselves on the bottom? So why would the misogynistic attitudes of Black men then not hinder Black women to have similar levels of education, social mobility, criminalization, abuse, etc.? We should see huge disparities then if Black men were primarily perpetrators and not victimized, right? We should see unidirectional violence like we did for a long time with whites. The other part about that is, if Black men were participating in patriarchy, then how do you explain the upward trajectory of Black women and the downward trajectory of Black men? Because patriarchy should privilege all men over all women, right? So again, this is what I mean by valuing Black women's experience, because I'm not negating that at any point, but asking, well, what is the consequences and implication of that experience? Because a white woman will say, well, because of this, I have less wealth, I've had less acquisition of X, Y, and Z compared to a white man. When you look at the overall history of Black men and women, both were discriminated against. Black women have traditionally been more employed than Black men, have certainly been more educated, certainly demonstrated higher social mobility, and they have similar rates of victimization across the board with the exclusion of homicide. So how do Black men design that within our communities, right? And these are the questions that Black male studies is trying to ask. It's not trying to take a political stance. It's asking, well, if you want to hold that view, then why does Black patriarchy so greatly disadvantage Black men where it advantages white men? Right? These are questions that we don't have answers to, right? And I think you're right. I think that the hostility in Black studies towards focusing on men and different forms of masculinity is profound. And I have no problem, if Black male studies has to become independent departments. But what I would hope, for the sake of our communities, is that this is a message that translates well with other people, mothers, sisters, etc. Because these are problems that we have as a group, right? It's not like Black women are going to rise if they get great jobs and Black men don't, because we know that the wealth grab is largely driven by the income gap between white men and Black men, not between white women and Black women. That's just what the social science tells us.
Thank you so much. So I think we have time for two more. Let's and I know, I'm so sorry. We have some great questions. And we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So I'll just have to go in the order in which they were received. This question says, Dr. Curry, social media is inundated with the Black feminist intersectional understandings of gender that you explain are problematic. Most students today only understand race and gender through this lens. What is the best strategy to counter the social media narrative in students who spend most of their free time online?
Wow. I'm not a big fan of spending most of my free time online. I got too much work to do. No, but I think, honestly, I think, I've seen a little bit of this on Twitter. I think it's important for Black men and Black women who disagree with intersectionality to debate this issue out. Right. One of the strengths I think of university settings is that there's a free exchange of ideas. And if I'm pointing out what I think to be a problematic and fatal flaw in intersectional interpretation of data, I think we should debate this out. I think these should be formed throughout classes, et cetera. So I think students should just be just as vocal, point out the work that's refuting it, point out the data that's refuting it, and engage in it that way in a marketplace of ideas.
Excellent, excellent. And let's see, we have another that is asking about books. So it's this question says, I highly enjoy your book on William Ferris. I am currently reading the book on Alexander Crummell you recommended. Are there any other Black male authors you feel are missing in history? They're asking probably for a reading list.
Yeah. I mean, I would say offhand that I enjoy the work of J.A. Rogers. He wrote 3 volumes on race and sex. It's just a historical document. One of my favorite people to read, of course, is Jim Sedanius. He's at Harvard. I think he's retiring relatively soon. But most of the stuff that you read, in the academy is not going to be from archives. It's going to be what people were taught in grad school. But if you email me or contact me, I'll send you one of my syllabi, and you could dig into that for yourself.
All right, excellent. And let's see, we'll take one more. It says this, Dr. Curry, thank you for your presentation. Do you think one of the reasons why Black feminists insist on participating in anti-Black male rhetoric is a result of the breakage of the Black family in the United States? Meaning Black female feminists do not see Black males as a part of their community?
Yes and no. I say yes and no because it depends where you start in the literature, right? So if
Yeah.
you start with the idea of feminism all the way back to 1868, the idea was that Black men were in fact detriments to women's rights. And this idea wasn't very widely shared, well into the 20th century until the 1970s and 80s, when you get these white women writing about interracial rape and domestic violence. And then you start getting from like the National Black Feminist Organization that was co-founded with Gloria Steinem, some of these writings around and activism around this issue. So yes, there's an argument to be made that some Black feminists in the 1970s did not see Black men as part of their community because they saw Black feminists as kind of like a different social species. But by and large, that I don't think that's the orientation that most Black women have had. So some Black women, I think, generally believe that Black women are oppressed within the Black community because of race, sex, and race, sex, and class, and that Black men are part of the perpetrators or oppressor class. But that class antagonism doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. So I think that most of the issue here is, in many ways, how racism has kind of distorted and made differences in our communities, right? So think about the Monahan Report, which is really based on Dollard's work, in the 1930s. When you look at this, they're really trying to study ghetto culture. And in ghetto culture, all these ghetto studies that were created from the 1937 forward were all about how Black men didn't belong in households, right? So what ends up happening is you have this paradigm that Black men are antagonistic to Black families, either because they leave or because they're violent. So that's why they started studying Black men as street men. Now, what ends up happening is street men, because they're unemployed and they drink, perpetuate higher levels of violence. So there's this idea that's created by white social scientists that Black men on the street are always violent towards the women and children. So this is how you separate Black men from families, right? And we know that this stereotype exists today. I think Black feminism incorrectly asserts that this separation is in fact true. That part of the reason that Black men have such high proclivities towards deviance is because they're not good fathers, they're not good communicators, they don't have deep feelings of love and affectivity. Again, things that data all refute, but nonetheless, I think is reproduced in the works of people like Bell Hooks or Mark Anthony Neal, etc. So that's why I'm saying it's a yes and no question. Yes, in the sense that if you take a strictly historical view, you can see where Black men are thought about as being outside of the home, outside of the community, are a danger to it. This is contra culture violence theory, and that influenced like the second assault Or on the other hand, you can see where it's just a class antagonism that's birthed from the kind of theories that Black feminists are utilizing, like Marxism, like psychoanalysis, that pits male against female and assumes that that is a characteristic that exists within our communities. But overwhelmingly, when you start studying Black communities, when you start interviewing Black women, they understand that Black men are woefully more disadvantaged than they are in some regards, because Black men generally tend to struggle with employment and education in ways that Black women as a whole don't in this country. Poor Black women certainly do, but there is a recognition from Black women in various communities that Black men certainly do get the brunt of lethal and societal violence and ostracization. So again, it's a nuanced conversation, and I don't want to throw any group under the bus, but I think that we need to actively point out the problems and some of the assertions and theoretical orientations that intersectionality and Black feminism do make around Black men.
And this will be the last one. I promise this will be the last one. Do you believe Black Lives Matter is detrimental to the Black community? That was a question. Black Lives Matter.
I mean, look. So I wrote a long article about this. I think Black Lives Matter is ineffective towards the Black community, and that it tends to privilege elites and people who become social media celebrities rather than working class Black people, working class Black men and women that have to deal with the deaths of Black men and boys and the effect that has on their communities and their families. I come from a first generation Southern, economically deprived area. So I take the murder of Black people, especially Black men and boys, very seriously. And I think what's happened is that white liberals have created a caricature of the disdain and the striving that working class Black people created in fighting against police violence historically, and put it in intersectional representatives that we are too afraid to ask very simple questions of. And this is not to say that queer Black women can't lead a movement, but this is to say that if you're going to lead a movement, then you need to make sure that you represent the interests of the people that you claim that you're leading the movement from. And what we have not done is we have not critically engaged the so-called leaders of Black Lives Matter to ask, do you represent my ideas? Do you represent my voice? Do you represent my values and my interests? So every time we have an argument about who we're electing president of this country or who we want to be a political leader, that's what the debate is. We're saying Trump doesn't support Black folk, get Trump out of office. But suddenly Black Lives Matter comes up. Black communities have not seen a single cent of the millions of dollars that are being invested into anti-racist education and towards the BLM banner. And Black communities have not been allowed or provided a forum or platform to ask if these people who are claiming to represent our pain and benefit from our deaths somehow represent and make do or create reparations for the communities that are losing all these young Black men and boys.
Yes, sir.
And I think that that's the tragedy of Black Lives Matter.
Oh, that's it. Drop the mic right there, Dr. Curry. This is excellent. This is excellent. We want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you were blessed by the knowledge and the wisdom of Dr. Curry, and we thank you for your scholarship and your dedication to Black male empowerment. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your awesome insight. This was wonderful, and I'm going to look at this over and over again. Thank you so much. At this time, we're going to
thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. At this time, we're going to transition. We're going to bring out the individual who made this possible. Dr. Lawrence A. Rashid has been in education for about 20 years. He has taught at the elementary, middle, and high school level. He's also been an administrator. He is currently the African American student coordinator faculty, part of the faculty at Lane College in Eugene, Oregon. He has a doctorate in administration and educational leadership from the University of Pacific in Stockton, California. He is the co-founder of RAMP, Reaching African American Males' Potential. It was a charter school that opened up in the fall of 2007. He is the founder of GRIOT, Greatness Rediscovered in Our Time. He is an unapologetic mentor of African American males. He's associated with the NAACP, the Urban League, and he's also an alpha. He's my brother from another mother. Give it up for Dr. Lawrence Abdul Rashid. Dr. Rashid.
Man, oh man, I just wanted something like, I can't come after these brothers. I mean, this is a rock star panel. So thank you all, my brother from another mother, Dr. Francis. Definitely want to thank our president at Lane Community College, Dr. Hamilton. Dr. Tommy Curry, you know how much you've inspired me. Dr. Bonner, Brother Lynn. I want to get back up there because I'm missing some church chicken because you know how your wife throws down, and it's been a blessing. I definitely want to acknowledge the people behind the scene, Randy, Deontay, Terry, everybody that made this possible, the foundation, DSU, the Multicultural Center, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, Mr. Evans, Tracy Weimer, Marcia Seals, and just the list goes on and on. If I didn't mention your name, blame it on my head, not on my heart. This has been phenomenal. And, just all these panelists, how I feel about you. I mean, I've been inspired by your research. I mean, Dr. Fred Bonner was on my dissertation committee. I mean, I learned about critical race theory by way of Dr. Tommy Curry, and then into Dr. Marvin Lynn. And then, so all of you all have been very instrumental in my trajectory. And I'm just excited that I'm able to bring the scholarship to Lane. And I'm excited that we're able to offer a Black Male Studies course here at Lane Community College starting this spring. So I'm going to say that, and this has just been phenomenal. Man, I can't wait till it's up on YouTube so I can just watch it again and again. So, and I hope that I could get some of you all to come to my course. I know you all are rock stars. I know you all are busy, but I'll be texting you and emailing you, hey, can you come in here and just share with, some of our scholars your knowledge. And, we want to keep this going. And so, again, thank you so much, Dr. Tommy Curry, for taking out time with your busy schedule. I know it's getting late on your end of the world. Again, my brother, Marvin Lynn, Dr. Bonner, my 06 brother, and Dr. Francis, phenomenal job, and everybody behind the scenes. So thank you. God bless. Have a great evening.
And so at this time, as we close this wonderful session, we just want to leave you with the words of Dr. Candy, who argues, if the heartbeat of racism is denial, the heartbeat of anti-racism must be confession. I believe that many will acknowledge the country's racist past, but fail to see its racist present. And so we must move beyond surface friendships and forms to definitive actions and outcomes that ensure Black male empowerment and halting the psychoacademic holocaust of Black males. We can focus this afternoon on symbols of racism, or we can seek to neutralize the source of it. We must stop being reactive and become proactive by challenging the myths that have served as pillars of American democracy. Black Lives Matter has to be more than just a hashtag to be posted. It has to be a mindset manifested through economic equality. If millions are willing to march on behalf of a Black man who is now dead, then why not move on the part of millions of Black men who are still living? As with Dr. Martin Luther King, too many Black men are deified in death, but devalued and disregarded in life. In conclusion, protests are great, but we must protest with a plan and a purpose. Without clear outcomes, we will be left with the memory of a movement, a moment that we never turned into a movement. So at this time, on behalf of Dr. Hamilton, the president of Lane College, we say good afternoon, and we wish you love, peace, and soul. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.